Okay, technical sorted. I will be speaking in English. I apologise for that because I'm aware everyone here is, or most people here are Italian, but I hope you follow my English. I'd like to start by just thanking Luca and Giovanna and everyone from the university here for inviting me over to Milan to speak today. I'm going to be talking about what we do at magCulture, some recent projects, and I'm going to be introducing some of the magazines that I think are important in the context of a lot of the conversations that we're going to be having today. And I should mention in passing, one of the things I do in London is organise an annual event about editorial design, and so I know how much work goes into these events, and so I think we should all be very grateful to Giovanna and Luca and everyone that's put their time and effort into making this day happen. Anyhow, let me just get this right around. So I run magCulture, which is a very small design studio in London. I've worked for much bigger companies, but at the moment I'm very content to be in a much smaller environment where we can do some of the things that Luca was talking about in terms of experimenting and challenging what's happening in editorial. We do a lot of design work for print and for digital in the editorial sphere. The magCulture originated as a blog, just talking about magazine design, editorial design across the world, but we now publish at least one article a day on our online journal. I do a lot of consultancy, work with various clients both in the UK, Europe and globally. I've written several books. We organise events, as I mentioned, curation and exhibition planning. And we've just opened a magazine shop. But what draws these all together is the love of magazines, and that love isn't based on some sort of a nostalgic idea for a time when I was younger and magazines were much more central in our media diet. It's because I trained as a graphic designer, and for me, magazines and editorial design is the very heart of graphic design. It's where graphic design began. Before it became more of a marketing and advertising tool, it became a tool of information. And magazines are about entertainment, yes, but they're also about information. And I think the sort of soul and heart of graphic design lies in editorial design. I love the way you can combine text and image with design on a page or a screen and make it something completely different depending on the nature of the story and the angle on the story that you wish to communicate. So I'm going to talk about several themes today which will be woven into what my speech. Just to quickly introduce, during the noughties I was working for large publishers in the UK where we produced a lot of magazines for clients, and I'm showing you some here. I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but something I learned from the experience of working for so many different types of magazines was that, in fact, the most important thing, whether you're dealing with print or digital, the most important thing for an editorial product is the reader, is the end user, if you like. So we're looking at a bunch of magazines here that were created to help supermarkets, banks, airlines, etc., government agencies. But each one had a different role to play. Each magazine had a different audience to address and a different message to convey. And it might be a very simple thing to explain and a simple thing to describe here, but I'm going to take the example of these two magazines that we made at the time at the company called John Brown in London. They were both very particular. I was proud of both these magazines because they had a very particular, special job each to do, but they were both very particular to that job. So on the right is Sky magazine, which was the biggest magazine in the UK at that time. You have Sky Television here, the satellite TV service. Well, it originated in the UK, and this was the subscription magazine for that service. So this was published monthly, and we were printing 7 million copies every month. So this was by far the biggest magazine at the time in the UK. But I felt it was a strong, well put together magazine of its type. It was what it was. It had a purpose to it in terms of selling Sky. As a subscriber to such a service, the only communication you generally get from the satellite company is a bill at the end of each month, and so that can be very easy to become a negative process. The magazine was meant to remind you of the benefits of paying that bill every month. It had a job to do, but we made a good magazine out of it. It was a strong, celebrity, glossy magazine. On the left was Carlos magazine, which was we created for Virgin Atlantic, for the airline, who wanted. We'd been making a project with them for a long time, and that ended after. I can't remember which airline disaster it was, but there was a problem in the airline business, and so the airline business is such that if you're putting the weight of items being carried on a plane matters enormously, and in this case they'd stopped producing their online magazine but wanted to do something smaller and cheaper and easier, and we came up with Carlos, which was effectively a fanzine for regular flyers on the Virgin Atlantic route. And you can see here on the right that for B-Sky B, it had to be celebrity, it had to be glamour, it had to be very much following the traditional rules of magazine making in terms of eye contact on the cover, numbers, lots of copy. Whereas Carlos was much cooler. It was much more aesthetically minded in terms of how it presented itself. It was meant to be a very different prospect to the other magazine, and it's a simple thing to explain. It's a simple thing to say. But if we had made a magazine that looked like that for Sky, or a magazine that looked like that for Virgin Atlantic, they would both have been completely wrong, completely incorrect for what we were trying to do with those projects. I learned a lot from this. Around about the same time as doing this, I began to put what a lot of the work, the magazines I'd been collecting when I travelled into a book project, which is where the magCulture name came from. I wanted to collect. Well, I was collecting magazines, and for most people, quite rightly, magazines are temporary. They are a passing thing. They are something. Most magazines are something that come across your table and disappear, whether they disappear into the recycling or they disappear to a friend. They are a temporary item. They are more often not a book or another item. So, and yet they have, for me, and partly a function of that temporariness is that they are a fantastic reflection of the time in which they are made. Of course, at this stage we're talking purely print magazines, but in print they are not only for their written stories and the imagery that they present, but also the design contains lots of clues and records of a particular era, and they're a fantastic kind of recording device for that. So I began to produce a series of books which recorded some of those magazines. And the name of one of those books was magCulture, which is where the name came from. As a research tool for a potential second magCulture book, I launched a very small website. It was just a WordPress thing. I've always been keen to experiment with new technology and new games, new toys, new whatever. And so I set up a WordPress site and registered magculture.com. And I just wanted to record stuff, and I wanted to use it to attract people to send me stuff for another book. But actually it became something in its own right. I think partly because it launched at the same time as, certainly in the UK, at the same time as the publishing industry was finally waking up to the fact that the internet was a really valuable research tool. So suddenly all the art directors and people involved in publishing had proper broadband access to the web, and one of the things they were looking at was my little website, and so it grew, and that got me to be involved in a project called Colophon, which was a very important project in my career in terms of what it led to beyond that. I think a lot of the events I do, a lot of the events that happen around Europe and the world now around independent publishing owe themselves to the Colophon event. This is actually a poster from a small London off branch of it, but the original colophon events took place in 2007 and 2009 in Luxembourg, where I've just come from. Actually, I'm still doing a lot of work in Luxembourg, but that's the state of Luxembourg is in the background there. And Colophon was a 3-day celebration of independent publishing. We had, as well as a hall with speakers for the whole 3 days, we had an exhibition of the magazines for various in independent magazines. We produced a book with 10 different covers called We Love Magazines, which looked at the production process of a lot of the history of magazines, but also looked at how magazines come and go. And I think there's a lot of sort of, if we're talking about the publishing industry being in a state of crisis or permanent change and flux, I think we also have to remind ourselves that magazines do have a natural time span, that they do, however great, however valuable, however important a single magazine is, there comes a time when perhaps it needs to stop, it needs to cease for whatever reason. Times change and the magazine hasn't kept up with those times, then they will end. So one of the projects in that book was to celebrate a series of magazines that were very influential and important in their time, and acknowledge them, but also acknowledge that they were dead. Another thing we did over the weekend was to create a magazine. So we had an audience of about 1,000 people, and they were all illustrators, designers, editors, and writers and photographers. And so we enlisted them to record the whole event in front of us. So we set up a large flat plan on the wall, and we invited them to join us. And we gradually filled up with photography and reports of all the talks and events that happened over the weekend. And then we presented these. We printed it as a magazine. We didn't print it in time for the end of the event, but by the Sunday night, when we had the goodbye drinks party, we were able to project the whole magazine up on the wall. So we made the magazine in 72 hours. We had a dedicated team working on that, but it was another interesting experiment in terms of making something happen very quickly in the editorial sphere. And here are a few spreads. But meanwhile, my website was still going. And it's developed further, it's got more sophisticated, and it's now, don't refer to it as a blog, we call it a journal, and we're very consciously trying to move away from the kind of blog feed format where stuff just disappears. It's all about the new. So now we publish at least 6 stories a week, so each week any day you visit there's a grid of stories, so we're encouraging people to check back and look at other stuff. The search function works strongly because if you search for a particular thing, you see a grid of 6 stories relating to that subject, and there's further plans around that. One of the stories as it clicks through. Giovanna was very kindly translating what Luca was talking about, so I had a flavour for some of the things he was saying, and I think I probably agree with just about everything he was saying in terms of his summation of the industry and some of the points. And I know one of the themes of today is the issue of independent versus mainstream and what is independent. This was a particular project. This is a particular project that led me to various specific conclusions, which I'll come to. This is a charity project that I put together with a friend on behalf of a third friend who had reason to have some money raised for him. He was an American art director who had had an accident without having any insurance at the time, and the health situation meant that he was trying to raise money. And so we did this transatlantic project where we invited magazine editors and art directors around the world to contribute their favourite magazine, not just their favourite magazine in terms of a series of magazines, but their favourite single issue of one magazine. And so we just presented them alphabetically as a series, and they're credited at the bottom. I think Francesco Franchi was one of the people that contributed. I couldn't find his page, unfortunately, but when I was researching this. But you can see here we've got 60s magazines, we've got some more contemporary magazines, we've got very contemporary colours, Carlos I already mentioned, but also classic magazines like the Sunday Times magazine, Harper's Bazaar, but these are all presented alongside more contemporary magazines. So by having an open invitation for individuals to send in one copy of one magazine, and then presenting them alphabetically, we just had this kind of complete mix of new, old, German, Italian, French, American, Dutch in this case, very contemporary, very old. A real mix of magazines, and what I learned from that was, having done a lot of compilation books and put together all sorts of kind of overviews of contemporary material, was actually that magazines, whatever their provenance, whatever their era, whatever their subject, they all have a particular language, and they all sit together, and that's something I believe firmly in relation to whether something is independent or mainstream or however you want to describe it. I prefer now, even though for the sake of definition, the sake of having a conversation about these things, we need to divide things up and pigeonhole them and specify that a magazine is this or that. Those definitions have a role, I understand that. But there's also, in the end, for me, I strongly believe that it boils down to two very simple piles. On the one side, there are good magazines, and on the other side, there are maybe not bad magazines, but magazines that aren't as good as the other pile. Some other spreads from that. And around about the same time, I helped curate a large American design exhibition where I was doing the magazine component. And again, I found it in being asked to pull together, for an American audience, to pull together a series of magazines that summed up the state of the industry at that time. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. I found I wanted to have the sort of big popular magazines like New York Magazine, Bloomberg Businessweek, Wired. These were all important magazines creating important advances, both in print but also digital in terms of editorial. But also the smaller independents like these two British magazines. It's not as simple as saying that all the great magazines are indie. An independent magazine isn't automatically a great magazine. It's an interesting magazine more often than not, but it's not necessarily great. There is such a thing as a range of great magazines, and they transcend definitions beyond indie and mainstream. This is my most recent book, The Modern Magazine. This was a visual overview where I was looking at what design brought to the party. I was the main thrust of this book, apart from it being an overview of that era, was that art directors and editors are increasingly becoming the same person, that this is a singular role. It's not that you want one person doing it, but you need to have, if as designers, and I'm assuming most people in the room are designers. Do we know that? Yeah. Can we put? Can you raise your arm if you're in design rather than writing? Okay. Oh, no one's understanding. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, if you're the reason I was drawn to work in editorial design was that as a designer, I got to be involved in the content. I got to be involved in decision making around what I was designing, and that's what I love about editorial design. Whereas other forms of design you tend not to be so specifically involved in that sense, and that's why I was arguing in the book here. And of course, we're looking at digital projects. One of my favourites remains the New Yorker. Thank you. iPhone app. Just going to quickly run through some recent pieces of work. This was a series of books that I was invited to design. They were books that wanted to look a little bit like magazines, so we took quite a kind of typographical magazine approach with the barcode on the front. They had belly bands that wrapped around them, and they didn't quite end up as magazine as I wanted them to be, but the idea was to play with the join between books and magazines. Some recent editorial projects. And I was interested to hear Luca talk about crowdfunding and Kickstarter. We used Kickstarter to launch this magazine, Fiera, which is about the design fairs. interior and product design fairs, in particular the Salon here in Milano. So we've done 3 issues of that, and we're just about to start working on the 4th edition of this magazine. Another project we've been designing with the young art director called Holly Catford is Noble Rock, a wine magazine which seeks to reinvent the wine publishing industry. Perhaps not quite as bold as that, but it's trying to interest a younger generation in wine, or at least in more than just drinking wine. And they've just recently opened a wine bar in London, and it was fascinating to see the logo we designed for an editorial context transferred to a living context like that. And then as I mentioned, I do a lot of consultancy work, and these are some projects. I've just come from Luxembourg, where I've been I work with a local publisher there called Maison Moderne, and these are 3 of the products that we're publishing there, and that I'm very involved in seeing what happens with them. Just quickly, some digital work. Aeon magazine is an online project which publishes an essay every day in long-form writing, 5,000 words long, well-written by specialists. And this is where you go a little deeper into it. I'm not going to go into great detail, but of course here is and this is where the frustration of digital from a design point of view tends to be that when you're preparing something like this and you do some screen grabs and you realise something's gone wrong with the drop cap, and it's and a couple of iPad apps are put together. One was with the independent magazine Port, and that we started off using DPS, but then moved to HTML5. And Freeze, the art magazine, I devised that for them, and they're still publishing that, and that's made using DPS. I'm not going to go into I mean, talking of the frustrations of digital work. So this is this issue, I think, was the second one we did 4. This is from 2011, and it's no longer viewable, and that's really it's really annoying. Obviously I've got the assets and I can piece it together and I could make something of it, but it's still, for now, it's dead. You can't see it. The Freeze app it continues. So I mentioned events in London. This is the Modern magazine, which happens once a year, where we pull together a similar event to this. About 200 people come. We have a lineup of speakers. It's one day. It's one very long, intense day. But we're very keen to mix up people. I'm going to talk about this project. This is the 2 founders of the magazine Mush Pit, which is a small British women's magazine, which I'll come to later. But they shared the stage with Scott Dadich, who's the editor-in-chief of Wired in the US. So that's the kind of mix that we're putting together. It's a celebration of print and digital magazines, a celebration of all types of magazines. It kind of serves to highlight what we at magCulture regard as interesting touch points of the moment. But it also, we try to head off and try and seek some of the issues facing the industry. And one of the things I particularly enjoyed about having Scott Dadich involved in the event, he was meant to come over, but unfortunately his flight failed. But we did a Google Hangout, which worked surprisingly well. We had a conversation, and one of the things, I'm not sure whether Luca mentioned the first iPad app as being the one that Wired made, and Scott Dadich was very much the originator of that project. He was the driver of it. In fact, he was the driver behind the creation with Adobe of the DPS system. But it was very interesting talking to him about that, and how actually even Wired and Condé Nast now, although they were very much there at the beginning talking about and innovating and pushing forward DPS and the iPad in terms of the way that the digital magazines might work both financially and creatively, they've now moved on from that, and they now regards that as a very useful experiment, a valid thing to have done, but now we've moved on from that completely. And at these events we have a pop-up shop where we sell things, including my latest book, which I just want to quickly mention, called Independence. So if books like magCulture and the Modern Magazine have a lot of captioning, a lot of essay writing. There's a lot of written material in there, but they are also very visual. They're very deliberately visual records of the time that when the book is being made, and they're inspirational and celebratory. What I wanted to do with Independence was actually dig a bit deeper and find out what a group of English independent magazine makers were feeling, what their experience had been about making their magazine. They're actually, it was about a year ago now, I did a series of live interviews, one a day across 12 days with one of the editors. And those 12 interviews were then transcribed and edited and published as this book. So these are the 12 magazines, and we took each of the front cover, each current front cover, and basically blurred it to make a series of front covers for the book. So there were 12 front covers. The books were all the same, but we did a series of front covers that were just based one per magazine. I'm too far away. So we had fun with that from a visual aspect. So slow. You get the idea. And one of the people we spoke to was John, who's the editor of iMagazine, who's going to be here later speaking. We spoke to Polly from RAP, but the point was it was a long-form interview, so it's an in-depth investigation of how these people started their magazine, why these people started their magazine, what regrets they have, what they've learned, how successful they've been. And it was a really fascinating process because, and it kind of ties into a lot of what Luca was saying in terms of when you look at the business models that people are relying on today. There was not so long ago. It was quite a simple thing making a magazine. It wasn't easy, but it was simple in the sense that you had two incomes. You had copy sales, the money you made from selling your magazines, and you had advertising sales, as Luca was talking about. You had ad sales, and the two sums of money went together and they covered your costs. You might also have been involved in events and maybe one or two spin-off things, but these were useful extras rather than fundamental. Now, I think it's fair to say that all 12 of those magazines, all 12 of those projects are doing something slightly different. They're all trying to find their own way of establishing themselves to be financially successful. You can use Kickstarter and other crowdsourcing, crowdfunding methods to start your project, but you've then got to survive and continue. And I think it's probably fair to say that it's around about the third issue of a magazine. It doesn't matter whether you're weekly, monthly, quarterly or biennial, but when it comes to your third issue, that's the point at which the crunch happens. That's the point where if you're making a magazine, you're either you know whether you're going to be making it a fourth or fifth or sixth issue or not. There's all sorts of issues to do with cash flow, etc. around that. One of the most interesting interviews in the book is with a guy from Delayed Gratification. I'm going to talk about his project later, but Delayed Gratification is a quarterly magazine which is published from the UK, and his concern about being an independent magazine or being perceived as being an independent magazine was that you get compartmentalized into a kind of almost a ghetto of that, or that's indie. It's maybe not proper publishing. It's maybe not real publishing. It's a separate thing. It's very different. It's not concrete enough compared to mainstream magazine. So whilst he's benefited enormously and would agree and admit so, he's gained huge advantage from being regarded as part of the independent publishing scene. He doesn't want to be seen only as that. He wants his magazine to be regarded as a great magazine in its own right, regardless of whether it's this type or that type. And then recently, having been designing, editing, or doing all these other things, whenever I visit a foreign city, and I haven't, not sure I've established where I'm going to go here in Milan to find it, but there will be somewhere. I know Giovanna and I were talking about it last night. But whenever I travel, I always try and seek out a good magazine shop. And when I come to, when I leave the UK for the rest of Europe, I find, if I go to Berlin, if I go to Barcelona, if I go to Paris, there are fantastic magazine shops. And there have been some good ones in London. I know where I can go in London to get almost any magazine. But there's not one place where of the level of something like Do You Read Me in Berlin, or the Athenaeum News Centrum in Amsterdam. So with the growing interest and growing attention being paid to independent publishing, and just the growth in numbers, the volume of new magazines being launched, the new things happening, I just felt at any moment someone was going to put their money where their mouth was and launch a proper magazine shop in London. And at the beginning of 2015, I actually got quite worried about this, because I thought, well, someone's going to do it, and if it's not me, I'm going to be so pissed off. So I did it, and so spent most of last year looking for premises, and I found this old well, it's a beautiful 60s building, although it doesn't look like a beautiful 60s building here. It's quite a rare type of shop space in the City of London. But what pleased me about it was that it's an old newsagent or kiosk. It's a traditional magazine shop that had failed, and so I converted it into the magCulture shop. And so now we're selling magazines as well. And again, I can confirm one of the points that Luca was making about one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue in making printed magazines, is the distribution. Is lifting magazines, putting them in a truck, delivering them, and unpacking them. That is the heart, literally the mess that people get into when it comes to distributing and delivering magazines is extraordinary. And I couldn't do a talk without reminding myself of how lovely the shop is. But you can see that there's a large range of largely small independent magazines from all around the world. I had meant to make a list of the Italian magazines that we have. I don't think we have many Italian magazines. Maybe we'll have more. And we have fun with how we define different sections. In this case, we're just using kind of web language of most recent, most popular, which echoes the website. Because everything that we're selling in the shop is also available internationally online. And we have currently about 270 magazines in stock. And as you can see here, they are sort of smaller independents, but then we also have some of the bigger magazines like Wallpaper and Pop. We stock Vanity Fair. So it's a mix that reflects the magCulture journal. So that's a brief introduction to me and magCulture. But more importantly, and I've already sort of gone through some of the points I wanted to raise today, but I will echo them and repeat them. Something I get asked an awful lot is to define what is independent. In one sense, it's a very important question, but in another sense, it's as I have already explained, I hope, it's largely irrelevant. For me, it's about good magazines and bad magazines. And I think if we look at some of the magazines that do well for me, whether I write about them online or if I sell them in the shop or if I go to other magazine shops, these are a small selection of some of the ones which are at the forefront in terms of being successful as magazines, in terms of being viable as magazines, which is a very important issue. But I think what's particularly relevant here with these 10 is that they are viable and they are also creatively engaging and creatively interesting. It's a slightly arbitrary list. I could probably present 3 slides of magazines. There's a larger list to be had than this simple list, but I've just tried to make a variety of colours and make a nice slide. But these are 10 strong magazines that are doing strong things in their realms. And as I said, as I hinted at already, they're all doing something slightly different. They're all working to different models, using different things. Some, like Fantastic Man, The Gentlewoman, are biannual. They're fashion magazines. I mean, they're not purely fashion. They do offer a lot more than fashion, but they are geared to the fashion schedule. And they carry a lot of advertising, and they're very comfortable. They're able to sell their magazines for about £6.50. So that's, I'm not sure how much, but by the time they ship them out, they're available here, right? Yeah. And I'm not sure what they would charge once they've shipped them, but that's maybe about €10. So that's relatively cheap for this type of magazine. That's relatively low cost because of the volume of advertising they attract from all the big brands. Something like O3, and Fantastic Man's been around, I think 25 issues or so. The same with O32C, that's been around a long time. Apartamento, these are kind of like and Freeze, these are the kind of heroes of the independent magazine trade. These are the magazines that everyone else looks up to. These are the ones which have succeeded already, that have reached to a certain state, and the others around them, whether it's Lucky Peach, the food magazine from the US, Anorak, kids magazine, Kinfolk, hugely successful, very, very refined, very definite, strong, confident approach to what it's doing. Quite controversial in that a lot of people love it because a lot of people buy it. I know that from the shop. A lot of people hate what it stands for. That's fair. I mean, it's a very mixed. I come back to what I'm saying. Just because something's produced on a sort of independent, small basis doesn't mean to say it's the coolest, best thing in town. But it is a popular thing. And these are. But my point here is that these are all kind of reaching a kind of international distribution, and at a level where they're almost, if not already, selling the same amount as some of the mainstream magazines that we try to separate off. They are approaching the same kind of sales figures and the same reach as some of the big magazines that we might define as mainstream. So at what point do we say, well, these aren't independent anymore? These are now mainstream, and this is where the discussion about what is independent, what isn't, becomes slightly irrelevant. It's just here are 10 successful magazines who are doing very well in their market. They're all growing. They're all doing their own thing. They're doing it on their terms, which obviously is an important factor. And of course, it's important to remember that behind all these magazines, there will be, alongside behind in the history of these magazines, there will be a lot of similar projects which people tried to get off the ground and didn't succeed. It's not, success isn't a given. Success comes from really, really hard work. In a basic sense, it's not difficult, but it's not easy. It's a hard slog making a magazine and making a success of it. If you launch it yourself, but if you can break through and make it into a success, then you can create a business that is involved in all sorts of different other things. So we've got magazines here which are running events. Freeze, of course, has a huge art fair that takes place in London. They've just launched one in New York. Anorak do a lot of events. Kinfolk have a huge events program. They run about 450 events a year, and they do that by holding events 25 times. On one night, they will hold the same event in 25 cities through a network of people that work with them. O32C have a gallery in Berlin, etc., etc. So these are all businesses with multiple channels, with multiple parts. They're all, until recently, Fantastic Man and Gentlewoman resisted they deliberately avoided doing anything online. But I think, let me just check. Apartamento doesn't do anything online. They sell magazines online, but they don't put anything online. They're active on Instagram and Twitter. Well, not actually so much Twitter, but certainly on Instagram. But they defiantly don't put anything online. That's a deliberate, conscious decision, and so they're not just not doing it. They decided definitely not to. Otherwise, all these projects are as much digital as they are in print. So if those are the successful ones, what's coming next? What are the magazines that I see coming through? It's perhaps worth making the point of the kind of numbers we're talking about. So before I opened the shop, when I was simply writing about magazines and covering magazines, and maybe putting together slideshows like this and promoting them and talking about them, I would be receiving something like 5 to 10 emails a week, most of which would lead to a package in the post with some sort of new magazine project that somebody wanted me to look at. Now that I've got the shop and there's a more kind of commercial imperative to it, that's probably gone up to around about 15 to 20. So probably in an average month, I'm getting about 30 to 40 requests to have a look at a new magazine. So there's a lot of people out there wanting to do it. I've tried to, just from the recent things that I've seen, and pulled together some 5 brief themes. Change as in political or societal change, niche as in very, very narrow broadcasting type of magazine. Reading, which might seem slightly counter-indicative of what we're talking about, because of course people read magazines and it's part of the experience is reading, but there have been there's a definite resurgence of people wanting to produce kind of literary magazines of fiction and non-fiction and poetry, certainly in the English language. I sense when I was in Luxembourg talking to people, and I imagine it's the same here, there's probably still more of a, particularly given the Italian language, I think there's probably more of a history still of reading text in a way that perhaps we don't with English. I'd be interested to talk to maybe some of you after this about that. But certainly there's a resurgence in magazines just made to be read. Branded magazines, so organisations and companies producing magazines and using kind of the editorial sphere to promote themselves. And then the experimental. So if you start just running through those. So the state of the Middle East has been an ongoing kind of political and social concern for decades now, but there's a particularly bad situation there now, of course, as we're all aware. But there's one guy, Ibrahim Nahem, who lives in Beirut in Lebanon, publishes The Outpost, which seeks to say that it tries to produce good news about the Middle East would be to really abuse what it's trying to do. It calls itself a magazine of possibilities, and it's not about the bad news of the Middle East, but it is trying to just suggest that there are other ways of advancing things in that sorry area of the world. It's a fantastic magazine conceptually. It's a beautiful looking magazine, and its message is unquestionably one of good. It's a curious magazine in that if you try and pick out individual pages, they don't speak. It's very much a magazine of you have to flick through. So I'm not going to show you any more of it. I just encourage you to track a copy down. We've seen a resurgence in attention and interest in the ideas of feminism. Ladybeard is a new British magazine, which, as the name suggests, the word lady is a particularly polite English word for women or female, and beard is beard, and putting those two together, it kind of gives you a sense of I think of where the magazine's coming from, in that it's covering advancing women's rights and women's positions, but also dealing with transgender and gay rights issues. The first issue, this is the first issue, it's a beautifully designed magazine, beautifully art-directed magazine. It uses all the kind of techniques that we know from the independent magazines we're looking at in terms of The Gentlewoman and magazines like this. But by taking the theme sex for the first issue, they've met the kind of the heartland of the feminist discussion right head on. And they've it's a very bright, simply designed, beautifully designed, brightly coloured, very illustrated, perhaps a very familiar kind of floral reference to sexual experience, but then they get very graphic as well, and they're absolutely not scared to just meet and take on the kind of imagery that perhaps in another sphere would be regarded as pornographic. Another women's magazine I mentioned earlier, they spoke at the Modern Magazine conference last year, is Mush Pit. This takes a very different angle to that of Ladybeard, but it is just as challenging. So this is made by two young stylists that work in the fashion industry. It's a magazine about their world, their lives. But it also, whilst it has a lot of humour, it's a very English sense of humour in terms of. So this is a very referential kind of and self-effacing kind of taking the piss out of themselves point of view of what's going on in their heads. So they're concerned about. There's elements of seriousness in terms of worrying about politics and other elements, but they're also worrying about their age and have they got enough Instagram followers and all the kind of it's a summation of the concerns of the magazine. But they're doing things, they kind of biting the hand that feeds them, as we say in English, where in this case they borrowed some very expensive fashion handbags from the likes of Dior and Fendi and then shot them in the bathrooms of a train and a toilet at the back of a bar, and sort of really abused the beauty of these items by putting them in a very mundane, ordinary situation. And if that's kind of slightly obtuse, this is much more to the point. This is one of the issues facing the City of London and so many cities and so many parts of our world today, is the way that people are just putting up big buildings and letting them out and just making money out of these buildings. There's sort of little thought for urban planning or future thinking. So this is a kind of a parody of a real estate advert where they're talking about another stunningly depressing development, and they have a list of facilities which includes a gym, a swimming pool, no poor people, nothing interesting, mostly empty. So they're using the language of real estate advertising to mimic and parody it. And in a more political sense, they've taken what was the Labour Party's one of the main two, the left-leaning political party in the UK, which message was New Labour, and they're talking about New Labia as a way forward, which is on the one hand is just parodying and taking the piss out of the whole situation, but is actually developing into a particular campaign, which I'm looking forward to follow in the new issue, which is coming up shortly. All of these magazines can, to some degree, be called niche. But some are more niche than others. This magazine, Tom Tom, is a magazine for female drummers. So if you drum and you're a woman, this is the magazine for you. Maybe there's 2 or 3 of you here, I don't know. But this is a serious magazine. This is issue 24. It's published from the States, and it has a huge audience. It's established an audience for that, what would apparently be a very, very small niche. Lunch Lady perhaps isn't quite so niche, but it starts as from a very particular niche point of view. This was actually, it grew out of a blog that was launched in Australia by a woman whose young daughter was being, not sure she was being bullied, but she was being teased about the fact that her mum gave her a healthy lunchbox to take to school. So she was being given fruit and healthy food, and her daughter was being teased as a result. And so the mother launched a blog to try and support and try and promote the idea of healthy eating at school, and then out of that grew a magazine, and that is a magazine about food and family. But again, it's quite a specific niche. It probably reaches out in a way. More naturally, perhaps, than the drumming magazine, but it has health advice and it has a very specific aesthetic, which is about young children and playing around and cooking for kids, etc. But it also takes a kind of slightly anthropological view on the history of motherhood and looking at the roles of women through the ages, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc. the north of England in the 60s, the northern cities of England had a very progressive and modernist building program in terms of building the factories and public housing, etc. And in the city of Manchester, there is a small campaign to try and look after these buildings that were built during the 60s and 70s. And the Modernist is produced by the Manchester Modernism Society, and it's a very small magazine, but it sells really, really well because there's a huge interest in the kind of late 20th century architecture today. And so yeah, so it's a very stark black and white modernist design magazine, but it does a lovely job of presenting the kind of history and recording the history of these buildings. It's a small niche, but there's a large architecture community that are very interested in that. Reading. As I say, obviously reading is a key part of what your reader or end user is going to be doing. But I think if there's a criticism that gets levied at independent magazines, wrongly in my view, but a lot of these magazines I've been showing you, people can easily fall into the trap of criticising them for being very pretty looking, beautifully made, fantastic items of design and production. But people will say, oh, there's not much to read in them, there's not much content, there's nothing real in them. Now, I would vigorously argue against that point of view. I think magazines like that I showed you, like the Gourmand, like the Fantastic Man, like the Gentlewoman, like Appartamento, have got a lot of content that is not only meant to be read, but is worth reading. But we're seeing now areas of publishing which, all those magazines I've just mentioned are dealing with celebrity and fashion and food, and they're quite popular, easy subjects to get people to engage with. Peeps is a magazine that comes from Canada, which is about anthropology. And this is a rare magazine, a rare subject for magazines per se, but it's trying to translate what is quite an academic subject into a far more popular environment. And so we meet the first sociologist to be hired by Microsoft. So it's and the discussion is what is a technology company doing with sociology. We discover how the underside of the Chinese dream, the growth of the middle class, and the growth of the westernization, if you like, of lifestyles of Chinese people. The underside of that is that it's great if you're successful, but it's tougher if you fail. What happens in China if you're not successful? And I mentioned literary magazines. Little Atoms, actually, this is another example of a magazine that grew out of a digital project. Little Atoms is a podcast that's published in the UK, and they've just published their first sort of compendium using the material from their podcast and printing it. So we have a series of what they call tapes, which are transcriptions of their essay of their podcasts. But they also commissioned a bunch of new essays, and this is solid reading. This is proper, full-on reading. If I go back sort of 10, 15 years to that point at which the digital sphere began to cross over with the editorial sphere, the one thing that a lot of art directors and designers and publishers were talking about was they were panicked into thinking that they couldn't present text like this. So certainly in the UK and the US, they were panicked into thinking that people wouldn't read unless you have to help them read. They've got an internet point of view. They've got a really low attention span. You have to help them, or else they're not going to read it. And I think now we're just in the most simplest of ways, just rediscovering that actually, if the writing is well written enough, if the content is strong enough, and you get that content in front of the person that's interested, they're going to read it. And perhaps the most important thing underlying all these magazines, and I would argue all editorial projects going forward, the most important thing is that you engage really strongly with the people that you want to engage with, and deal with quality rather than quantity. I think publishing is on the whole, has chased quantity. And that comes from the time of advertising, where you need to have high numbers in order to appeal to advertisers, because all that mattered was if you could prove you had 400,000 subscribers, well, fine, the advertisers were in. Those advertisers have fallen off the edge now, they've gone. So that idea of quantity being a beneficial factor, that's over. You could deal in quality through every element of it, and I think that's something that runs through these independent magazines and is what the best of the mainstream magazines are taking on board and learning from. As are brands and companies and organisations. I mentioned that I'd worked at John Brown, where we did a lot of projects like this. What's interesting now is that the companies and brands that might once have gone to an agency like John Brown and said, we're interested in producing an editorial project, they're doing it themselves now. They're making content and creating it and publishing it in various channels themselves. So if you take a brand like Rafa, which is a British-based cycling accessories company, they've been hugely successful, but again, everything they do is underwritten by the idea of quality. It's expensive equipment, but it's good equipment. They've been creating lots of content online for the last sort of 8 to 10 years. Lots of video footage, lots of shoots, lots of written content supporting their fundamental message, which is that they want to get every single person in the world on a bicycle. They also want to sell lots of accessories, of course, as well, but nonetheless, the primary concern is to celebrate cycling. And they just launched, this is the second issue, the third issue is about to come out. They launched a magazine which, to all intents and purposes, I sell it in the shop, and it sits really beautifully next to all the independent magazines. But it's a commercial piece. It's for sale. It's made by a brand. It does speak about that brand, but it also has really good content. It has lovely content that celebrates cycling in the best sense. And there are a whole range of magazines now about cycling being made by passionate people that love that activity. And this sits very, very well alongside them. It succeeds because it's honest. It's honest about coming from Rafa. The people that love Rafa, the people that buy Rafa and associate and wear and deal with Rafa love Rafa, and this speaks to them perfectly. That it's absolutely on message in a very positive way. A similar project created in-house is Guestbook, which is a small format kind of guidebook type thing made by a company called One Fine Stay, who are a kind of high-end version of Airbnb. And they have a lot of catalogues and videos online about their properties, and that's very not dissimilar in the way that is presented to how Airbnb or other rental and real estate companies present their properties. But in this case, this is the soft part of the project, if you like. They have the hard part, the hard sell part. This is the soft part, which is about enjoying travel, enjoying the cities. We sell this in the shop because it's a lovely magazine. So it's got great content. It's got a beautiful illustration, as this cover shows. It's a good magazine in its own right. I grew up in a world where, I first discovered magazines through music. And I would rush out to buy my copy of NME every morning, every week, every Thursday. And that's how I found out about what I was going to be doing at the weekend. It's kind of the nearest thing I can say is kind of NME was my Facebook, if you like. But Pitchfork, the large American music review website, has been largely responsible for undercutting and has had a huge effect on the music publishing industry because they put it all online and it's free. So that you could argue that Pitchfork.com has caused the end of a number of music magazines. But then a couple of years ago, they launched their own magazine. So they've gone from print into digital. The Pitchfork Review absolutely takes everything that an independent magazine would expect to be able to enjoy. So it's got long form writing, it's got beautiful papers, it's got various papers, it's got high production values, it's beautifully made. It's a proper piece of publishing. It's not, again, it's not going on and on about Pitchfork. About half the content is new, and the other half is stuff from the website, but extended and improved. The interesting thing about this project is that Condé Nast have just bought it. They've bought the website, they've bought the magazine, and it's going to be very interesting to see what that brings, not just to Pitchfork, but what their model brings to the whole Condé Nast environment in the States. And the final example is The Happy Reader, which is published by Penguin Books, which, of course, was the originator of the paperback book. And that's, in the 40s and 50s when they did that, they opened up the world of publishing and literature to a whole new market that we take for granted these days. And while some of the magazines we've been looking at are big and they're thick and they're heavy and they use beautiful matte paper and glossy paper, etc., etc., this is a magazine that's perfectly tuned to Penguin. It's on heavyweight newsprint. It costs £3. It's everything that the paperback book was when it first arrived. But it's not about Penguin Books. It's about the enjoyment of reading. Each one has a celebrity of some sort on the cover. In this case, it's the singer-producer Grimes. So half the magazine, I think, from the design here, you can see both in terms of the typography on the left of the article itself and the kind of use of footnotes. It's a very literary approach to the presentation. But the first half is interview with, in this case, it's Grimes. And the second half takes a single book, and it is a book from the backlist of Penguin Books. It takes a single book, and first of all, it gives you an overview of that book, and it gives you a kind of history and contextualizes it in terms of looking back at what was a book from 120, 30 years ago. It's an Émile Zola book about a department store in Paris. But then thereafter, we get a whole load of contextualization in terms of history and culture. And it builds up the information around that book. So we hear about the Haussmann plan to completely convert Paris into the landscape of Paris. There's a small fashion shoot featuring the stylish women of Paris, etc. And there's various aspects are considered to kind of flesh out the meaning of that book. And if it's the first issue that you've seen, everything becomes clear on the final page where they talk about the next issue of the magazine. And here we're told that the next issue will be about a particular book. And so what it's doing, it's encouraging you to buy that book, so you'll then read that book. So when the next issue of Happy Reader comes, you've already read it, so you can read the editor's words and you can read the contextualization, and it actually acts as a virtual book club. So it's taking the idea of a kind of book reading club and moving it into print. And it's a really eloquent, clever piece of publishing. It doesn't go on about Penguin, but it celebrates reading, and it's a great brand piece created on behalf of Penguin. The final section of the experimental, I think do I need to speed up? I'm going to speed up. 3 projects here that because in the end, there's lots of beautiful magazines that do great things, but the ones that really, really get me are the ones which are playing with the form, which take the form further and maybe a little harder to explain. So something like MacGuffin, where jumped ahead. MacGuffin is a Dutch magazine in English language. It describes itself as being about the life of things. The first issue was about the bed. The second issue was about the window. And before you think that these are niches of the super niche, of course, if they were just about that, they would be very, very niche. But actually, they use those very, very particular items to just expand upon it, a bit like the Happy Reader does for that particular book. So around windows, we meet a British guy who has a huge collection of windows. He has 6,000 windows in a warehouse. But of course, these aren't just windows. These are windows that have been gathered from famous buildings around the world, from particular situations. He's got the original windows from Buckingham Palace, etc. So he's got a history in windows, and it's a fascinating story to hear him talk about the subject. We hear of the history of window decoration, I'm very aware that as I travel through different countries, different cultures have different ways of covering the light in their windows. Not least in Holland, where there's a particular thing about having green windows, where you don't use material or man-made items. You grow greenery into the windows. And there's even a history of the Popemobile, the cars that are used to transport the Pope when he visits different countries in the world. And he needs to be visible, but he needs to be protected, and that takes a particular type of window. So there's a history of that. So as you can see, so it takes that simple daily item. You know, there's at least a dozen windows in this room we're in now. We take them for granted, but it uses them to spin off and tangents which they've researched heavily. It's a beautifully made magazine, and it's full of surprises, and that's what you want from a magazine. Flaneur is a similarly kind of taking a very particular one item and using it to spin off. In this case, they visit a different city for each issue, and they not only visit a city, but they visit one street. So the editorial team from Berlin, for this issue 5, they visited Athens, and they defined that the street Phokionis Negri there is going to be the street they're going to cover, and they make a whole magazine about that street. It involves art, it involves editorial design, it involves literature, it involves photography, it involves, of course, at the moment in Greece, there's a huge political and financial meltdown, so they don't avoid that, and that's the one piece. The whole issue's in English, but this piece is about the I think he's now the ex-finance minister, is in Greek. They use editorial devices like photo stories to tell stories about the street. So this actually does use that kind of the photo love story. And they play with typography. So, you know, again, a long read, but they're talking about water in the river, and they're creatively engaged with it. And one last example that I published on the journal this week. One of the things I think we take for granted with magazines is that there is somehow that what the content they present is the truth, that it's inarguable. There is a sort of ongoing discussion that online things can be a bit fake, but in a magazine, because it's printed, it's always going to be the truth. Well, this magazine, Unstate, it has some very serious academic essays about culture and image making, but it also has some absolute nonsense about image making. Oh, went the wrong way. So, for instance, it opens with an extraordinary essay where they try and tie up the singer Nicki Minaj and present her as someone that actually appeared in the first piece of filmmaking that was ever made back in the 19th century. And they talk about her cultural importance and give her this fake history. We hear about various situations that are famous for the photographs of that situation, and we're talking about they talk about these pictures, and they refer to YouTube videos of Minaj and her booty, Miley Cyrus, and the various aesthetics to do with the video industry, but all along the line. I mean, everything's true, but nothing. All the links they're making are completely fake, and that fascinates me. Similarly, they take. Some of you might have recognised the still from a Pasolini movie on the front cover of the magazine. There, the singer Morrissey from the Smiths once included a reference to Pasolini in one of his songs, and so they've taken the text of an interview with Pier Paolo Pasolini and the text of an interview with Morrissey, who never met, of course, and they've run them together as if they've had a joint interview, and they've tried to make links between the two pieces of text, and there is satisfaction to be had between this link. But if you read it and take it on surface value, you assume these two people are in the room together having this conversation. Of course, they're not. My favourite piece, because this is my era in terms of music and such, is a story about Ian Curtis, the singer from Joy Division, who killed himself the day before the band were meant to go on tour in the US. And this piece engages into the fantasy world of what if he had got to the US. And it confuses it with all sorts of other cultural events, and it is absolutely, I mean, It's completely fake, but it's completely fascinating. And I love the idea that you can take this kind of very serious academic approach to design and presentation, and that it can challenge your expectations. This is something that an independent magazine, of course, can do, and it's acknowledged that that's what the independent world will do. And one of the defining factors of an independent magazine should always be that if you're going to make a magazine, make it your own magazine. Don't follow someone else, make it your magazine. Do what you want to do. I firmly believe it's much better to make a magazine and fail, but fail sort of feeling that you did what you wanted to do, than it is to try and toe the commercial line and make something that you hope people want. And that's something that sings through from everyone making these magazines. The people that are successful are the people that keep to what they believe in. So I really enjoy the way that that plays with that. But of course, it's not just these magazines, it's not just independent magazines that can do that. Earlier this week, the German weekly magazine, Zeit magazine, faced a problem because this is a weekly newspaper that's published every Thursday in Germany. And they were celebrating their 70th birthday. It's the 70th anniversary on the newspaper. And there was going to be a magazine with this copy. And so there was a lot of celebration about the fact that it was 70 years old. The problem for the magazine was that it was only 40 years old. So it hadn't existed 70 years ago. So how was it going to celebrate? So what they did was they went back and they created a fake issue. They created the issue that would have been published on the first day that the newspaper was published. So this is a magazine that has a profile of Marlene Dietrich, who had just come back from the US, having been a war refugee. She'd left Germany to escape the Nazis, so she'd just returned. So it looks at what she'd been doing, and the whole magazine is given over to actually as if it had been published in that year, 1946. Even the crossword, even the regular items like maps and various regular franchises that appear every week were adapted to suit the time of 70 years ago. So it's fake as well. But so why not? So mainstream magazines can do this as well. And this is a fantastic magazine that always rises to the challenge on a weekly basis of being creatively proud, creatively engaged, and doing beautiful things like this. You know, it's a great magazine. So I'd just like to end on that reminder that it doesn't matter whether it's independent or it's mainstream, a newspaper weekly magazine. It's just got to be a great magazine, and there are many of them still left. I think that's it, if I can get there. Oh, I was just going to remind you, so all pretty pictures. So I've talked about these magazines. Again, I could fill up three or four slides of these. All promising great things. Maybe not all of them are going to come through and succeed, but as I say, it's much better to be pushing forward and trying and experimenting, having a go at it, than trying to do something safe. Thank you.